The cabin buzzed with a typical pre-flight chaos as passengers settled into their seats on Flight 247 from Washington National to Newark. Among the travelers was a young man seated in first class, recognized by many despite his unassuming demeanor, Barron Trump. Towering over 6 feet tall and carrying a quiet, reserved presence, Barron sat by the window, engrossed in a hardcover book. His boarding pass bore a name that drew attention, but his behavior suggested he preferred to avoid it. Across the aisle, an elderly man shuffled toward the economy section, his silver hair neatly combed and his military jacket adorned with faded patches and medals, a silent testament to his years of service. Passengers whispered as he passed, some admiring his quiet dignity, others curious about his history. The man took his seat at the rear of the plane, wedged between a talkative businessman and a restless toddler. Moments later, a commotion broke out as the veteran grew visibly uncomfortable, insisting he needed to change seats. Apologizing profusely, he caught the attention of Barron, who leaned into the aisle, his brow furrowing. Without hesitation, Barron pressed the call button for a flight attendant. When she arrived, he spoke softly, asking, "Can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The attendant, momentarily stunned, promised to check. As Barron stood to retrieve his carry-on, murmurs rippled through the first-class cabin. A woman seated nearby leaned toward him, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You don't have to do that. You paid for this seat," she said. Barron simply shrugged and replied, "Some people deserve it more." The flight attendant returned shortly, confirming the switch, and Barron made his way down the narrow aisle toward the veteran's seat. Passengers whispered and subtly reached for their phones, capturing the unexpected moment. When Barron arrived, the veteran looked up, his weathered face filled with surprise. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked. Barron smiled and extended a hand. "I want to. Thank you for your service. Please, take my seat." The sincerity in Barron's eyes left no room for argument. The veteran stood slowly, shaking Barron's hand before making his way to first class, where he settled into the plush seat, visibly overwhelmed by the comfort and the young man's kindness. A flight attendant brought him a drink and a blanket, explaining the gesture. The veteran smiled faintly, his voice soft. "It's been years since I've been treated like this." Meanwhile, Barron adjusted to the cramped economy seat with ease, returning to his book as if nothing had happened. Passengers around him exchanged glances and whispered admiration. Even the businessman beside him muttered, "Never seen anything like that on a flight." Up front, the veteran glanced back occasionally, his expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. The atmosphere aboard the plane shifted. What had begun as an ordinary flight now felt extraordinary, charged with the weight of a simple yet profound act of kindness. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the veteran, who had been quietly gazing out the window, suddenly turned to the woman seated next to him. "I need to say something," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. What followed was a revelation that left the entire cabin in stunned silence, setting the stage for an unforgettable journey that would forever redefine the meaning of compassion and the unexpected connections formed through a selfless act. The plane hummed softly at cruising altitude, its cabin filled with passengers in various stages of relaxation or conversation. In first class, the elderly veteran, now seated in Barron Trump's vacated spot, adjusted the small purple heart pin on his lapel. His hands trembled slightly as he took a deep breath, his gaze distant yet reflective. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman noticed his demeanor and leaned slightly toward him, curious. "That young man who gave me this seat," the veteran began, his voice low but steady, "his family once saved my life." The woman blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. The veteran sat back, his expression tinged with nostalgia. "It was decades ago, during the Vietnam War," he began. "I was stationed overseas, far from home, with no family to support me. I was badly injured, shot twice in the leg, and when I finally made it stateside, I was lost. No direction, no purpose, nothing." His voice wavered, but he pressed on. "I ended up in New York, trying to rebuild my life. I had nowhere to stay, barely enough money for food. One day, outside a diner, a man saw me struggling. He didn't just hand me $1 and walk away. He sat with me, listened to my story. That man was Donald Trump's father, Fred." The woman's eyes widened in shock. Nearby passengers, who had been discreetly eavesdropping, leaned in closer. "Fred Trump?" she asked, incredulous. The veteran nodded, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "Yes. He didn't owe me a thing. but he made sure I had a roof over my head and a job to get back on my feet. He never asked for anything in return. He just said, "You served this country. It's the least we can do." I'll never forget those words. By now, the story had caught the attention of several passengers in first class. Murmurs of amazement spread through the cabin like ripples in water. The veteran's voice grew stronger as he continued, his eyes misting with gratitude. I always wanted to thank his family, but life moved on, and I thought the moment was lost forever. And now today, his grandson has given me a gift I'll never forget. What are the odds of something like this happening? In the economy section, Barron Trump remained oblivious to the growing buzz. He sat quietly, engrossed in his book, his long legs awkwardly folded in the cramped space. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in first class had transformed. Passengers exchanged glances, their faces reflecting awe and admiration. A flight attendant approached the veteran hesitantly. "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" she asked. The veteran hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Not yet. Let the boy have his piece. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me, not right now." The revelation, however, had already set something in motion. Across the aisle, a man in his early 40s spoke up, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but your story really hit home. My grandfather served in Vietnam too. He used to talk about how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help. Hearing what Fred Trump did for you, it's rare. Too rare." The veteran nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's the little things, son. People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. Back then, I thought my life was over, but that man's generosity gave me a second chance." Nearby, a young mother cradling a sleeping toddler joined the conversation. "My dad used to say the same thing," she said softly. "He wasn't a veteran, but he always told me that when someone lifts you up, even just a little, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction. What Barron did today, it's proof that kindness still matters." The veteran's expression softened. "It's true. It's not just about big gestures. Sometimes, just being seen, being acknowledged, can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me. And today, his grandson reminded me of that." As the passengers shared their thoughts and stories, the flight attendant sat on the armrest of an empty seat nearby. Her voice was filled with emotion as she said, "My brother served in Iraq. He didn't talk much about it, but when he came home, he told me the people who stopped to thank him or helped him in small ways. Those moments stuck with him. Sometimes, they were the only thing keeping him going." The veteran nodded, his gaze warm and understanding. "Your brother's right," he said. "It's the little things that keep you grounded when everything else feels like it's falling apart." In the back, Barron noticed a few passengers glancing his way. Their faces reflected admiration, but he offered only a polite nod, unaware of the story unfolding in his name. His simple act of kindness had triggered a wave of gratitude and connection that spanned generations. The veteran turned back to the flight attendant, his tone contemplative. "Gratitude doesn't stop with the person who helps you," he said. "It grows. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life, and I've spent every day since trying to honor that by helping others." Today, Barron reminded me of that mission. Funny how life works, isn't it? The plane jolted slightly as it hit a patch of turbulence, but the mood in the cabin remained steady, almost reverent. Conversations flowed like a shared catharsis, connecting strangers through stories of resilience and kindness. As the plane began its descent into Newark, the buzz quieted. The veteran sat by the window, deep in thought, while passengers exchanged knowing glances. Just as the captain announced the final approach, the flight attendant who had heard the veteran's story approached Barron in economy. She knelt slightly to meet his eye level, ready to share the story that had turned an ordinary flight into something extraordinary. As the plane descended into Newark, the hum of the engines was accompanied by a growing sense of connection among the passengers. In economy, Barron Trump was engrossed in a book, its cover obscured from view. A flight attendant approached him, her demeanor calm but purposeful. She knelt slightly to meet his gaze and spoke softly. "I wanted to let you know," she began, "that the gentleman you gave your seat to shared something extraordinary about your family. Would you like to hear it?" Barron looked up, curiosity lighting his face. He closed his book slowly, the title remaining a mystery. "Sure," he replied simply, his tone even but intrigued. The attendant paused briefly, searching for the right words. "Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, "Helped that man when he was at his lowest point," she said. "He told me your grandfather gave him a place to live and a job, expecting nothing in return. And today, you did something for him that reminded him of that same kindness." For a moment, Barron didn't respond. His expression remained composed, but his eyes softened, betraying the impact of the revelation. Finally, he said, "That's something, isn't it?" The flight attendant smiled warmly. "It is. I thought you should know." As the plane touched down, the cabin grew quieter, as if the collective mood had shifted. The veteran in first class stood and began to disembark but stopped. To everyone's surprise, he walked toward the economy section, his eyes scanning the rows until they settled on Barron. Barron, now standing to retrieve his bag, looked up in surprise as the older man approached. The veteran extended his hand, his voice filled with sincerity. "Young man, I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today brought me full circle. Your family has a history of kindness, and you've carried that forward. Never forget how much these moments matter." Barron shook his hand firmly, his voice quiet but steady. "I didn't do anything special, sir. You deserved it." The cabin was silent now. Passengers watched the exchange with rapt attention, some visibly moved. A few had tears in their eyes, others wore soft, thoughtful smiles. The connection between the two, generations apart, seemed to embody the enduring power of empathy and gratitude. As passengers began to disembark, many paused to thank Barron for his simple yet meaningful gesture. Others approached the veteran, offering handshakes and words of appreciation for his service. The mood on the plane was unlike anything anyone had experienced, a rare moment of unity in an otherwise routine journey. At the gate, the veteran turned one last time, tipping his hat toward Barron. "You've got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose that." Barron nodded, his reserved demeanor softening just enough to reveal the impact of the veteran's words. As he made his way to the baggage claim, he pulled out his phone. After a moment of hesitation, he typed a brief message and hit send. It read, "Grandpa would have been proud of today." This story reminds us of how a small act of kindness can ripple far beyond the moment, forging connections and leaving lasting impressions. Kindness, gratitude, and empathy transcend time and place, creating bonds that endure through generations. If this story inspired you, share it. Let's keep the conversation going and remind the world that kindness still matters. And if you'd like more stories like this, subscribe and join us next time for another unforgettable journey.